So let's begin by reading chapter 9, verses 1 through 10 again. And tonight we should finish
You say
chapter
the last
9.
time?
Yeah, I said that last time. But the thing is that each time I say it, the probability of its being true increases. So, it's kind of like I'm not uttering a complete falsehood, verses 1 through 10. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship in an earthly sanctuary. For a tent was prepared, the outer one, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of offering. It is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain stood a tent called the Holy of Holies, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, which contained a golden urn holding the manna and Aaron's reed that budded and the tables of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. These preparations having thus been made, priests go continually into the outer tent, performing their ritual duties. But into the second, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the errors of the people. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the sanctuary is not yet opened, as long as the outer tent is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various baptisms, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. So we have Moses' tabernacle. So what's wrong with Moses' tabernacle? What are its limitations?
Plus the who, how, and when that the people can worship.
Say more.
Huh. Well, who can be in there? Well, in the inner, only the high priest, and only once a year. And the others can be there once a week.
Well,
but the blood is only once a year for the real purification.
In the holy place, it's not once a week. They're there continually. And so there's
every day. Right.
So there's a change in I forget what they're called, but they're like there are a particular number of orders. Orders is like the wrong word, but there are groups of priests, and so a group of priests serve for 1 week.
1 day, yeah.
So they start on the Sabbath,
Right.
beginning on the Sabbath, and then they end on the Sabbath. And so the first act of the priest is to replace the bread of the presence, and the priests leaving take the bread of the presence to eat. But then within that week, they continually go out. But so who? Only priests can enter the holy place, and only the high priest can enter the Holy of Holies. Also, he says the priests go continually into the outer tent. You kind of have the imagery of, like this frenetic activity, going and coming and going and coming and going and coming, performing their ritual duties. So they're performing this fundamentally the same ritual duties over and over again.
So like like prayers?
Well, no, I mean, the temple, although prayer happens in the temple, it's not really predominantly a place of prayer.
Mm.
Temple is a place of sacrifice,
Mm.
right? So what are the major duties of the,
But I thought sacrifice was only once a year.
no, sacrifices are continual, but the
Oh,
sacrifice for the people of God as a whole is on the Day of Atonement.
right.
The other sacrifices are for individuals, and those happen in the holy place. But the author isn't concerned with individual sin or individual anything else. He's concerned with the people of God as a whole. So the priests going continually into the holy place, they attend to the menorah every morning and every evening so that the lamp burns continually. They burn incense every morning and every evening. As the first act of the Sabbath, they replace the loaves of the bread of present with fresh loaves.
Mm-hmm.
And then they offer daily sacrifices. You should read this section on daily sacrifices. It's in two places. Leviticus chapter 6, verses, well, it's kind of long, 8 through 30. Maybe we should read a shorter version, which is Numbers chapter 28, verses 1 through 10. The Lord said to Moses, command the sons of Israel and say to them, my offering, my food for my offerings by fire, my pleasing odor, you shall take heed to offer me in its due season. And you shall say to them, this is the offering by fire, which you shall offer to the Lord. 2 male lambs, a year old, without blemish, day by day, as a continual offering. The one lamb you shall offer in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer in the evening. Also a tenth of an ephah of fine flour for a cereal offering, mixed with a fourth of a hin of beaten oil. It is a continual burnt offering, which was ordained at Mount Sinai for a pleasing odor, an offering by fire to the Lord. Its drink offering shall be a fourth of a hin for each lamb. In the holy place, you shall pour out a drink offering of strong drink to the Lord. The other lamb you shall offer in the evening, like the cereal offering of the morning, like its drink offering. You shall offer it as an offering by fire, a pleasing odor to the Lord. So that's the daily offerings. And then there are individual offerings. And then on the Passover, when you bring your lamb to be slaughtered and given back to you, and you cook it, and it's the Passover meal. So he ignores the details there. He ignores, in fact, the fact that there's sacrifice there, since he's really focused on the Day of Atonement, and he's focused on the issue of how are the people of God as a whole made perfect, he would say, or brought into right standing with God, which, of course, the old covenants and all these temple system is not prepared to do. So that go continually performing their ritual duties suggests, that those there's this frenetic activity performing these ritual duties all over and all over again, which suggests that they're not terribly effective ritual duties. Frenetic activity that has to be repeated for, sort of ritual cleanliness suggests that the cleanliness doesn't go very far. So what else is wrong, or what else wrong is probably too strong a word here, but what are the other weaknesses or limitations of Moses' tabernacle? Well, looking at verse 1 rather. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship in an earthly sanctuary. The sanctuary is only an earthly one.
Okay.
So Healy also makes the argument that cosmikos, or earthly, can also mean cosmic. And so the temple was considered a microcosm of the universe, which in turn symbolized the cosmos. And that's kind of true, but the author's focus here is really on contrasting earthly and heavenly. So one can see the earthly sanctuary and that kind of cosmic sense is pointing forward, because of course the temple itself wasn't cosmic and the temple wasn't. So the idea, was that ultimately the temple would become the center of a world. All nations would come to Mount Zion, right? All nations would come to worship the one true God. And in that sense, the temple would become the center of the world. But that promise was never realized under the old covenant. And in fact, the people of God, for the most part, particularly in the Holy Land, failed to proselytize or bring very many people into the faith. And in the diaspora, Jews were more successful at proselytization, but even there, it was limited. So there was never sort of a mass adoption of Judaism by pagan peoples. So here the earthly sanctuary is contrasted with the heavenly sanctuary. So as you said earlier, this is a shadow and a copy of the real sanctuary. So it's not the real sanctuary. So then he mentions the holy place. He mentions the Holy of Holies. Outside of the holy place is a courtyard. So the people of God can congregate in the courtyard, priests in the holy place, the high priest in the Holy of Holies, but only one day a year. So what does that mean?
Well, it means most people were separated from God then. They didn't have access to God.
Mm-hmm. And so access to God really is based on a sort of three-tiered system, actually implicitly a four-tiered system. People outside the courtyard,
Yeah.
which is to say, fundamentally pagan society, is completely separated. People in the courtyard are separated, but they're at least 2 places away. The priests are next to the Holy of Holies. So remember, the mercy seat is presumably where God is present, although, of course, God is present everywhere throughout his creation. But nevertheless, God is said to be present in the temple on the mercy seat. And so that's where God is present. The even the priest can't come into God's presence. God is still one room away, separated by a very thick curtain. And even the high priest can't go into God's presence freely. He can only do it one day a year. So access to God is very restricted. So on the one hand, it emphasizes the transcendence of God, the temple, in a very special way. And that's important because God is transcendent, God is wholly other. But on the other hand, it doesn't recognize God's unity with humankind or anything else. It leaves God as wholly transcendent and wholly other.
Can I ask a question?
Uh-huh.
So the golden altar was in the Holy of Holies.
Golden altar is in the holy place.
Oh, it's in the holy place? It's not in the Holy of Holies. It said behind the second curtain stood a tent called the Holy of Holies, having the golden altar of incense,
Mm-hmm.
the Ark of the Covenant covered
Yeah,
on all sides with gold.
we had discussed that, I think, 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
So the golden altar of incense is in the holy place. He places it in the Holy of Holies, not because he means it's literally there. So his focus, again, is not on individual sin, but on corporate sin of the people of God. So he's totally unconcerned with all the frenetic activity. The incense has to be lit every day. And so it can't be lit every day if it's in the Holy of Holies, because you can't go in there every day. So he's not concerned with that frenetic activity, because that's, from his point of view, all pointless. The important thing is the Day of Atonement and the forgiveness of the nation of Israel's sin. Or I should say, not the nation of Israel, since it doesn't exist at this point, with the sin of the people of God.
So he just brings in the bull for his sins and the.
So when the first action of the high priest is to take in the incense from the altar of incense. He lights a thing of incense and takes that in. And by his doing that, the author sees that as being the golden altar of incense in the holy place, as the incense that's taken into the Holy of Holies has its origin from the altar of incense in the holy place. If that makes any sense.
What about the sacrifice of the bull and the goat or whatever?
Then that comes next.
Okay.
Take
And
the altar.
And that's on that altar?
Yeah, that's by the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies.
Oh, how did it get there?
By the high priest taking them in.
So he took in that bull all by himself?
I'm not sure whether actually the bull is slaughtered outside and then taken in.
Okay. Okay. The ark, I know no one could touch it, right? So that could only go in the holy place.
Well, it for the tabernacle, it had rings, and like a pole would be inserted through the rings, and it would be carried that way.
Yeah, but
Remember,
nobody could go into the Holy of Holies except for the one priest, the high
right,
priest. So
right.
it had to be in the holy place, right?
What did?
The Ark of the Covenant.
No, the Ark of the Covenant is in the Holy of Holies.
So that one priest, the high priest, would take that into the Holy
Well,
of Holies?
the tabernacle was intended to be moved. So then the question is, when it's moved, what happens? And presumably when it's moved, it gets moved by multiple people because
Right.
so touching the Ark of the Covenant results in death, but carrying the Ark of the Covenant by the poles doesn't.
So there were other people that could go into the Holy of Holies.
To move it, almost certainly,
But not during the ritual, I guess.
but
Right.
not
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 during the
when
presence of,
but
yeah.
not when the tabernacle was stable and not moving.
Okay.
And they had 40 years in the wilderness, so they had plenty. And they mostly went around in circles. I mean, it's not a very long trip from Egypt to the Holy Land. I forget how long a ride it is, like by camel, but uh, it's not really long at all.
Okay.
So there was, probably a good deal of staying in one place and then moving a bit and going around in circles a lot and sort of frenetic activity to go nowhere, very much like uh, priests going um, continually into the outer tent performing their ritual duties. So we have this very increasingly restrictive access. And then we also, see that increasingly restricted access in to whom God speaks. And God speaks to the prophets. God speaks to some kings, but not others. And that's about the extent of the whole thing. So very restricted access to God. Look at Leviticus chapter 16.
16, what verse?
Start at 11. Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering so this is from the Day of Atonement, which is discussed in chapter 16 of Leviticus. Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself. And he shall take the censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of sweet incense, beaten small. So this comes from the altar of incense. And he shall bring it within the veil, and put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat which is upon the covenant, lest he die. Then we can stop there. So notice that the purpose of the incense is not only smoke rising up to God. Purpose of the incense is to create enough haze so that the high priest doesn't see God and die. So remember, we've talked before about the Holy of Holies being a fearsome place and a frightening place. And so in contrast to that, Christ is seated at the right hand of the Father. and presumably he doesn't need smoke to obscure the distance between them. The Mishnah says that after the high priest emerged from the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, the quotation is, he made a feast for his friends, for that he was come forth safely from the sanctuary. So getting out is a cause of celebration.
Coming out alive.
Coming out alive is a cause of celebration. So going back to the priest entering continually and the high priest once a year, Christ entered once for all, as both Hebrews chapter 27, verse 27 says, and chapter 9, verse 12 will say. So once for all versus ritual duties that have to be repeated continually. A perpetual ordinance to be observed throughout the generations of Israelites. Now remember, on the Day of Atonement, it starts with the sacrifice of the bull. The bull is for the sins of the high priest. It says like the high priest and his family. So one interpretation is that that's just the high priest and his immediate family, but the probably more correct interpretation is that it's the sins of the Aaronic priesthood.
That makes
But
sense.
but
Of the
so
whole tribe?
Yeah.
They had the 12 loaves of manna for the sacrifice, one for each tribe. So that would
Yeah.
make sense.
Well, this is just the tribe of Aaron.
Right. Right.
Or of Levi.
They're the priests. Yeah.
Well, the descendants of Aaron were all priests.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is that there's a glaring discrepancy between the sins of the priest or priests and the sins of the people. We have a bull, and the bull brings to mind the golden calf, which was Aaron's idea in the first place. So it's kind of an in-your-face reminder of the heritage of Aaron, which priests are supposed to be pure before the Lord, and yet they are sometimes the worst offenders. So a bull and then a goat or lamb, a vast disparity. So when we contrast that with Christ, Christ didn't need to offer anything for himself because he was sinless.
That he was the Lamb of God, right?
Right, but he was the Lamb of God. Exactly. So there's no bull involved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no bull involved.
Jesus was a once and for all, not a yearly sacrifice.
Right. Sacrifice does not need to be repeated.
Yeah, it says eternal redemption, securing an eternal redemption. The end of verse 12.
Mm-hmm. Right. So no need for repeated ritual sacrifices. Now think about, we have the blood of the bull, the blood of the goat or lamb. how does that help anything? So the bull and the goats are at best ignorant victims. And so remember, there are two goats. There's the scapegoat who's led out into the wilderness, presumably to die. So we have at best an ignorant victim, and at worst an unwilling victim.
Mm.
So how does that help to take away any sin? I mean, it might in an individual way if it's your goat, but this, isn't particularly someone's goat. These are animals offered for the corporate people of God. So they're incidental to the process. They're unknowing, they're unwitting, or they're possibly even unwilling. And you can't see the scapegoat being very eager to be put out.
No.
And goats are pretty intelligent creatures. For that matter, so are bulls. And you can make this whole argument about blood purifying and everything else. But nevertheless, it's the blood of an ignorant or unwilling victim. So there's, sort of a disconnect between those whose sins are being forgiven and the beings that are being sacrificed to forgive those sins. They don't quite connect. So what about Christ?
Christ was one of us. He was 100% divine and 100% person.
Right, and so what does that mean in terms of his sacrifice in contrast to the sacrifice of sheep and
He was willing
goats and
to
bulls?
die for us. He was willing to die for us.
Yeah, there would be a change in the people in the, giving something that didn't belong to them to begin with or wasn't precious to them. It wasn't their own property.
But so both as God and man, he freely gave up his life. It was his choice. He wasn't ignorant and he wasn't unwilling. So that disconnect, which is present in temple worship, isn't present here.
And he was the priest and the victim, the one who made the offering and was the offering.
Right. Priest and victim, king, priest, and victim. And chapter 9, verse 9, gifts and sacrifices are offered which cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper. We can view that in two ways. One is that the sacrifice has no effect on individual conscience. But also, he uses the word perfect. Remember, perfection he uses it to mean an ability to stand before God in righteousness, an ability to become righteous before God And so the blood of goats and bulls does not really offer a means to appear righteous before God. It is an external ritual that appears to create an external cleanliness that does nothing to redefine a relationship to God.
Which is supposed to be written in our hearts.
Which is supposed to be written in our hearts. And then also another way to look at this is sort of, you can say sort of levels of holiness, right? So we have outside of the courtyard, so the Gentile world, which is black. We have the courtyard and the people of God who can't enter into the holy place or the Holy of Holies because they're not holy. I mean, they're not as, I mean, they're not holy. So the Gentiles are grossly unholy. The people of God are not holy. The priests are supposed to be holy.
So when we say priests, that these are the rabbis and the Sadducees.
No, rabbis are not priests.
Oh, okay.
Priests are descendants of Aaron.
Okay. Oh, the
So,
Levites.
so there are descendants of Aaron who are priests. There are so all descendants of Aaron are in the tribe of Levi. So there are Levites who are descendants of Aaron. Then there are also Levites who are not descendants of Aaron.
Okay.
They serve in the temple, but are not priests. So all Levites, remember in allotting land to the 12 tribes, the Levites are not given any land. Their responsibility is the maintenance of the tabernacle. And so they survive by gifts and sacrifices offered at the tabernacle and then later the temple. So grossly unholy, unaware of Yahweh, the Gentiles, the people of God lacking sufficient holiness to enter the tabernacle. The priests, sort of a bit more kind of holy, at least enough to go into the holy place, but not holy enough to go into the Holy of Holies. And the high priest, who is holy enough to go into the Holy of Holies, but has to take a bull first because he's not all that holy. And the fact that he has to take a bull suggests that the sinfulness of priests is much worse than the sinfulness of the people, or the same sin committed by a priest, a high priest, is much worse than the same sin committed by a non-priest. So a hierarchy of holiness that is very clearly enforced and in some sense, very clearly visible. You can distinguish people of God from Gentiles. You can distinguish priests from non-priests. And when the high priest is fully dressed in his vestments, you can certainly distinguish him from everybody. So very, very striking. We're almost out of time, but just an aside, in the Babylonian Talmud, so this is about the Day of Atonement, but the Talmud says that this is a quotation from it. Our rabbis taught during the last 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the lot for the Lord did not come up in the right hand, nor did the crimson colored strap become white, nor did the westernmost light shine, and the doors of the Hekal, the doors of the holy, the doors of the gate to the temple would open by themselves. So for 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the ceremony did not go as planned. The lot for the Lord did not come up, so they draw lots for which goat is going to be the scapegoat in which to sacrifice. And the lot for the sacrifice didn't come up in the right hand as it's supposed to do. And the crimson colored strap put around the neck of the goat being sacrificed is supposed to come up white, and it didn't for 40 years before the Lord. The westernmost light on the menorah didn't shine, and the doors of the temple opened by themselves. So that's 40 years before the destruction of the temple. What happened 40 years before the destruction of the temple?
Sometime Jesus died.
Yeah, that's when Jesus died.
Wow.
And then also not Eusebius, what's his name? Josephus recounts a conversation shortly before the beginning of the Jewish-Roman War, that there were loud voices in the temple saying that they were leaving, and then the doors of the temple opened, and presumably the beings who announced that they were leaving left because they opened the doors to leave. So the implication that Josephus drew from it is that they were angels leaving the temple, and God's glory was deserting the temple.
Wow.
And so then the temple was, this would have been about 68, and the temple was destroyed in 70. So we're out of time. And next week, I think we finished this section.
Yeah.
So we'll do the next section next week, and we'll probably, well, we might finish that whole section. It's
Oh, okay.
chapter 9, verses 11 through 14 next week. Last week I had said when we start this new section to focus on covenant and testament, but that actually applies to the following section.
Okay.
That's in chapter 9, verse 16. So you don't have to focus on why does he shift from covenant to testament next week. That'll be for the following week, assuming we finish verses 11 through 14 next week, which of course we should, because I run a tight ship and I always make sure that we stay on track.
Your nose is growing.
Yeah, I'll have to decide if I need to go to confession this week for that.